Okay, brilliant. That is quiet, but I assume you can hear me now. So thank you so much once again for giving me the opportunity to present to UNECE, GRM, and our SDG 14 friends. What I'd like to do now is the next 20-25 minutes, hopefully, talk a little bit about what I call the universal conduct risk paradigm. As you will remember from our session earlier on, we talked about the link between organizational culture and conduct risk. And this one is an interesting one, the UCRP, how I call it. What I want to cover is I want to cover a little bit of the origination and evolution, because it does essentially come from the financial world initially. Then I want to talk about the potential application of this for UN Global Compact's SDGs. I want to give you a quick walkthrough through the paradigm, and I hope you all have A3 colored copies on your desks, because on an A4 or even on a screen it might be a little bit too small to read. But the beauty, I guess, of it is it's all in one space. And then very briefly I want to touch on the next proposed steps. So where does this conduct risk paradigm actually come from? Well, you would have heard this morning quite a bit from Justin, myself, and others. It comes out of a crisis situation that has impacted literally everybody around the globe. We're talking about the global financial crisis that started in 2017, at least lasted until, I'd say, 2015, and we probably see a fallout of it now as part of the Brexit and some of the political movements, elections around the globe, and the and sort of attacks to globalization. So on the one hand, we had the financial crisis. On the other hand, as you would have heard from Justin earlier on already, from a Central Bank of Ireland perspective and Irish regulators, but also in other places, you would have a regulatory response to this. So in the UK, this is where I'm based, we have got since 2013 what is known the Financial Conduct Authority. That was one of the responses. There's many papers come out in the past, Group of 30, from the Financial Stability Board, from the SEC in the US, from the Securities Commissions, IOSCO, Bank for International Settlements, and so on, all focusing on conduct risk. Initially, before 2013, a lot of focus was on what they used to call TCF, treating customers fairly, and retail conduct risk. However, that then moved towards what is now known as the wholesale banking conduct risk. And just going to the next slide, see if this works. Yep, here we go. So in 2013, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK was established. They've got the C in the name, and I got all excited, and I was sitting there back then waiting for an explanation from the regulators what they understand with conduct risk and how they define it. Guess what? They haven't done it. They didn't do it back then, and to this day they still haven't done it. So I took it upon myself in November 2013. I wrote an article, Conduct Risk, Doing What Is Right. That went out globally, did get a lot of good responses, and I also shared it with the regulators. Various other sources in the market picked up on conduct risk definition, and did their own. However, the regulator itself never properly defined it, unfortunately. I think it's a weakness, but it is what it is, and they have their reasons for this. So in July 2015, bearing in mind it took a bit more than 2 years, Tracy McDermott, the lady on this picture there, she's left the regulators now, but she was the acting CEO back then, gave a speech at the British Bankers Association on the 5 questions on conduct risk. And these 5 questions were quite high level, quite strategic, but they did give at least a little bit of an idea what the regulators would expect. So on the back of this, and with my regulatory contacts, I went on to them to meet them quite regularly and frequently, and try to identify what these 5 questions actually mean and how it translates into something a little bit more tangible, bearing in mind I work with many banks and financial institutions. So on the back of this, I developed this, what I called back then the new global conduct risk paradigm. This is for banks, financial institutions focus. Published that as part of a COSO ERM consultation paper submission back in September last year. And the reason I did this is I wanted to make sure it gets out in the public domain. I wanted to make sure it gets known, because if you don't do that, then some of the big consulting firms may come along and use it for their own purposes. So it was out there. I introduced it widely. I even shared it with the FCA, and I've received some very good responses from them. They liked it. In fact, they asked me where it came from, and I said to them, you gave it to me, but you gave it to me bit by bit, not on one page. It took me 18 months to piece this little puzzle together. So on the back of this, what I call the global conduct risk paradigm was introduced at this Institute of Risk Management event. You can see here to date who's seen it and who I'm kindly reaching out to. As part of who's seen it, I shared it with UNECE, GRM, our monthly group earlier this year, in fact in January. And Roland mainly gave me a lot of good feedback on it, and he said to me in particular, and some other group members, first of all, remove the F word, F for financial. And also he said, secondly, focus on all industry, UN Global Compact and the SDGs. And if you manage to do that, it should become universally applicable to governments, public sector bodies, corporations, NGOs, charities, SMEs, in fact, any legal entity, really. Okay, so I had a little challenge and I scratched my head because I didn't really know that much about UN Global Compact and SDGs. And on the back of that, I tried to figure out how we can make this more universally applicable. So I started with a definition of culture and conduct in a UN Global Compact context, and the definition I came up with was along the lines of what UN Global Compact is trying to achieve, but also so it fits in within the cultural conduct risk context. And the definition I have here is, it means, to me at least, establishing the right culture and conduct of integrity by incorporating the UN 10 principles, which you have heard about this morning, and that enables individuals and organizations alike to upholding their basic responsibilities to people and planet, setting the stage for long-term success, and also providing for continuous sustainable benefit. So you can see some of the themes we touched upon this morning: survival essentially, and a long-term sustainable benefit. Ultimately, that's also what the SDGs are aiming for. So conduct risk specifically within a UN Global Compact context, what does that mean? Once again, my interpretation: conduct risk is caused by actions or inaction. That is important, actually. Not doing something is also doing something, making a decision not to do something, of an individual, organization, or whole industry that lead to misalignment of the UN 10 principles, hindering broader society goals, and also by negatively impacting collaboration and innovation. Okay, so on the back of Tracy McDermott's 5 conduct questions for the financial sector, I thought, well, they are probably quite usable, but what do they mean for participants under the UN Global Compact? And the questions were really around establishment of right conduct and culture of integrity, and also identifying the conduct risks within the organization. So that's a strategic level, if you like. Then we're going further down, a little bit around the governing of the organization. So how do the governing body, board, executive committees gain oversight of the conduct of the organization? How do you actually implement that strategy? Next is, who is responsible for managing the conduct of your organization? So that's where it becomes a little bit more operational. And then what support mechanisms do you have to enable people to improve the conduct of the organization? That is really around processes, tools, mechanism, instruments, training, whatever is available to you to use that, and we see that in a minute. And then finally, the sort of catch-all question for all these 4 previous ones is, are there any perverse incentives or any other activities that may undermine any of these strategies that have been put in place to answer the first 4? So taking all this into account, I ultimately ended up with something that looks like this, and you would have this in front of you now. Hopefully you can see there the foundations of the what I call universal conduct risk paradigm. It's the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact right at the bottom. You've got the definitions and the drivers of conduct risk and culture at the top, and you've got the 5 pillars here that break that down nicely, and they are sitting in between. And with that in mind, I'd like to give you a brief, if I can, walkthrough UCRP. Risk definitions refer to the 10 principles, and they are also embedding the strategic objectives of UNGC. And then the 5 conduct risk questions, I've just mentioned that already, align with strategy and operations of the organization. Pillar 1, the strategy pillar, to the left, means an organization's strategy is ultimately the key driver for its operational activities. Why are they doing what they're doing? Because they want to achieve something. However, in order to embed the culture well, good conduct, of course, needs to become an intrinsic strategy element, and that's why it's sitting at that strategy pillar there. Culture clusters is something the Financial Conduct Authority actually coined a term, and it helps the regulators essentially joining the dots, but it also supports more consistency when they're comparing firms across each other. And the dots they are looking at is, what does the organizational model and the strategy look like? What is the leadership like? Purpose and values, people, stakeholders, what are the intangibles, and how is the organization being run? Organizations should, of course, also foster a strong culture of conduct out of their own desires. That is, why are they ultimately doing it? It's the pull. It's the voluntary boundaries they are pushing in order to pursue opportunities, whatever opportunities that may be. And pursuing opportunities ultimately means also taking risks. Boundaries they are pushing in order to pursue opportunities, whatever opportunities that may be. And pursuing opportunities ultimately means also taking risks, but it also means they need to satisfy the regulators. That's the push, that's the mandatory boundaries they are applying to that. But the question is, are they doing it just to satisfy the regulators? That's the old sort of tick boxing mentality, or are they doing it because they really want to do it, because it's their purpose embedded within them? And then any committee they have, so remuneration committees, risk committees, any kind of decision-making committees within the firm should ultimately refer back to and consider the 5 conduct risk questions when they're taking any decision. So the question is, how embedded is this strategy actually within the operation? Banks, in particular, over the past few years had spent awful lot, and we're talking millions of money, to improve their conduct risk frameworks. And the conduct risk framework, or an organization-wide conduct risk framework for any organization, would need to cover the main elements that are governance, ownership, accountability, program implementation, and audit. This really is where the strategy becomes operational, through implementing this within the organization, embedding it. And if the organization is global and matrix, the implementation, of course, has to happen both vertically and horizontally, as well across all regions, subsidiaries, and so on. So you can't leave anyone within the organization out. It needs to be all encompassing, and it needs to be holistic to make sure this all works. So then we've got some more operational type pillars. We've got quantitative components, and then later the qualitative components. Quantitative components point towards how well or not well conduct risk is managed within the organization. It looks at identification. We heard earlier on already definitions and taxonomies. in Justin's presentation. We talked about KXIs, the key indicators, control performance, risk indicators, and also monitoring and reporting. Now, this identification spans across the whole risk spectrum and taxonomy. It also needs to look at controls and escalation routes within the organization. They are all closely linked to misconduct-related operational losses, mitigants, and the consequences. And the monitoring and reporting of this looks at the use of reports, recipient of those. Once again, Justin mentioned early on some committee memos, committee notes, how they've been taken, how they've been disseminated. That would all fit in with that, and the effectiveness of management information systems in making actually informed decisions. Now, from a qualitative component perspective, these qualitative components look at softer tools and measures that are deployed to embedding a good culture and conduct, and they include standards and communications, training, staff-related issues, and external expertise. Very, very important, for instance, for government organizations that rely on input from subject matter experts and knowledge management around that. So both delegated authorities and escalation routes play an important part in the effectiveness of communication. Diversity is something that my regulatory contacts only recently have brought up, but I felt it was very important in an organization because it fosters diversity of thought, and hence I've included it in there. I think it's very, very important to have that. Otherwise, you end up with some sort of standardized, streamlined approach that might be a little bit flat and not really going down into the deep roots of why things are happening the way they are. And finally, retaining organizational knowledge is crucial for the going concern of the organization, and many banks in particular, but also other organizations, governments, have brought in external expertise over the time. The question is, how do you control that? What are the SLAs that have been put in place, and how do you manage the conduct around these vendors? And also, how do you ensure there's a going concern, there's a continuity, and how do you hand over all this information that's been generated over time, because you want to make sure the corporate memory doesn't forget. Finally, the last pillar, which kind of closes that a little bit, is the regulatory interaction. While the left pillar on the left side, the strategy determines organizations' voluntary boundaries, regulatory and regulation are the mandatory boundaries that are set. They can be overstepped, but it's going to cost you dearly if you do. Many organizations operate globally, whereas the regulator's reach is usually limited regionally. That in itself causes already problems, and we've seen that as a fallout of the financial crisis, but equally we've seen it in other sectors. Trade agreements is a big one at the moment, which everyone is aware of. Implementation of this paradigm, of course, requires central coordination and a global alignment of regulatory requirements, and we felt as part of UNECE GM that it's best cascaded down from a UN Global Compact level, so that'll be the push, but organizations can and should gather to discuss which lessons can be learned from each other's experiences, and that's more the pull then. It's also important to have peer reviews, thematic reviews, share big data which can support these efforts. And it's also important, we've seen that also during the financial crisis, that even the regulators make mistakes. And the question is, how do we manage and monitor and measure KPIs for the regulators? Now, finally, and I appreciate that it was a quick walkthrough, and I'm happy for any questions in a minute, but finally, as the next step, since we all got you as experts and our pilot in the room, we've been hoping and thinking that it'll be good if we could, if you all could gather together, do a peer review during the next 2 days. You have the document available to you. I've done already a peer review with Roland, who comes from a completely different sector and has given me some very good input, and I'm very grateful for that. But I'm sure you will have some additional ideas that might feed back into that. We then can do a revision where necessary. And on the back of that, we would like to come up with a proposal by this SDG pilot for a recommendation to deploy and roll out this UCPR to all the other 16 UNGC SDGs. And I don't quite know how we can do it, but I've been in touch with the executive director of UN Global Compact in Washington, and that could be one way to start with, or hopefully to get some stakeholder input, sponsorship, and support. And the other one is also we would like to think about elevating this up to UNGC level for education and application throughout the UN Global Compact. There's different ways how we could do this. I'm very happy to consider making that available as a open source license to UN Global Compact and allow them to use it wherever and however they want to use it. And equally, I think Lorenzo offered very kindly already to make this available on the UNECE GRM website. So that's the last point. And I guess with that, I open up for questions now, and I also look forward for this to be further discussed on day 3 and your feedback, if any. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.